It began with a dead battery under the Lego sun, a moment so ordinary Jacob had learned to treat it like a regular weather report, hot, noisy, relentless. He sat on the mud-smeared curb of a sleepy Lecky street, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the smell of petrol thick on his hands, the hood of his own sputtering Toyota upturned beside him. His toolbox was a faithful, battered companion. His radio played an old Fuji track through a speaker that rattled like it had stories to tell. Helen, 8 years old and already too familiar with the word wait, watched from the passenger seat, her school bag in her lap, her small forehead pressed against the cool glass as if that might summon a miracle. Mariam stood in the doorway of their single-room flat, with one hand pressed to the doorframe, the other clutching a thin list. School fees, light bill, the name of a pharmacy with the cheapest store-brand painkillers. Pride lived in the lines around her mouth. She had been proud since the day Jacob promised he would keep them fed, clothed, and above all, safe. Pride made her refuse charity. Pride made her keep her head high when creditors came to whisper. Pride now shook at the edges, a loose thread in a shirt someone else had once stitched. Jacob had not known how precarious they were until a neighbor, someone who watched from the stairway like a weather vane, told him that the schoolmistress had already written their names on a piece of red chalk, and would by next week stop calling Helen at her desk to ask if she would be coming back. The red chalk rolled under Mariam's tongue like a small stone. Jacob felt it like a cold draft in his ribs. He tightened a bolt and told himself he would find work the next day, the next, as if tomorrow could be negotiated into existence. That morning, when the Range Rover eased onto the street like a slow, deliberate animal used to being noticed, Jacob barely lifted his head. It was not the first time a foreign car had stopped. On Victoria Island and the rich parts of Lecky, cars were not just cars. They were small statements, rolling monuments to decisions that had been followed through. But the driver of this Range Rover did not jump out flanked by a driver or an assistant. The woman who climbed down, smaller than the car suggested, wrapped in a linen dress that smelled faintly of lavender and detergent, moved like someone unused to being at the mercy of mechanics and petrol stations. "Battery dead?" Jacob asked without looking up. It was a rusty line he used with strangers, a professional distance, a pared-down voice. The woman smiled with a kindness that did not seem practiced. Her face carried a quiet authority, the kind that had opened doors without apologies. Her hair was silver but kept, and her hands had the look of someone who touched contracts more often than engines. She introduced herself as Amanda Okoro.
Amanda's life was measured in numbers and margins, board meetings that lasted longer than some marriages, investments that resembled small nations' GDPs, a portfolio that, in Lagos talk, belonged to the realm of those who do not count bills in naira. She had built a company from a seed she would, on certain afternoons, tell herself had germinated right from the loneliness in her chest, the sterile bed years, the empty chairs at state dinners, the chairs at her own breakfast table. She had learned to surround herself with excellent people and to avoid being pitied. People stood at a certain distance from Amanda. They were always keen to be useful. Jacob crouched at the front of her car, wiped his palms on his jeans, and worked. He tightened a terminal here, coaxed a reluctant spark there. When the engine turned over at last, it was like the sound of a hand clap in a quiet church. Amanda listened and laughed, a sound so simple it was almost childlike, and reached into her leather bag with a slowness that suggested she wanted to make the moment significant. "How much do I owe you?" she asked. Jacob said the standard price, and then, because the sun had made his throat dry and the sight of a woman who could actually pay felt like an offense and a blessing combined, he added an amount that was more for his image than his pocket. Amanda shook her head and handed him a small envelope. "Keep the change," she said. Inside were notes so new they still held the geometric smell of the bank. There were 2 cards. One was glossy, black, Amanda's name embossed in gold, Amanda Okoro, CEO. The other was lighter, with a phone number and the line, "If you ever need help, call me." It was written not like charity. It was an invitation in a language Jacob hadn't learned to speak. He folded the cards and slid them into his shirt pocket like a coronation token. He felt absurdly like a child given a golden coin. He watched her drive away, the Range Rover's taillights vanishing like punctuation at the end of a sentence he had not expected to read. That card would not stay in Jacob's pocket, not because it was flashy, but because poverty has a way of stretching the length of a favor into a rope. When debt came like a monsoon, and the schoolmistress's red chalk began to look like headlines, Jacob thought of the card. A week later, swallowing what remained of his pride, he dialed the number. Amanda answered with a voice that sounded as if she had expected something like this to happen at some point. She had that calmness of someone who had sized up many needs and judged them. When Jacob, stumbling through apologies and explanations, finally said that his daughter might be pulled out of school, she did not ask him where he had gone wrong. She asked how many naira and how soon. "Take this," she said, and the next day a bank alert lit Jacob's phone. 1 million naira deposited as if it had always belonged to him.
The numbers sat there, glaring and obscene, like a second identity. He could pay the school, he could pay the bills, he could breathe. Mariam unfolded the news like a map. She did not weep at the first bank alert. She looked instead with a careful, measuring gaze, as if the money was a long, thin object to be inspected before being accepted. Pride can drink fearfully from charity. She thanked Amanda with a voice that kept all its edges. On the other hand, she warned Jacob in a low, dangerous whisper that night, "Do not be a fool." When people accept help, it is never a clean exchange. Help breeds expectations like seeds, and expectations can be burdens that rot if left to the dark. Jacob tried to contain it. He sent Amanda messages about the school, small gratitude like pebbles placed on a grave. Amanda replied with the ease of someone who knew how to make decisions that mattered. She asked about Helen's favorite books. She encouraged Jacob to take on more customers. She told him to get better tools. Slowly, their contact grew from transactional to personal. There were moments of mutual ease in that strange space where money had afforded them intimacy that neither had asked for. For Jacob, it was relief. Someone seeing him not as a man to be pitied for his smashed parts, but as someone competent, useful. For Amanda, it was a reprieve, someone who laughed at the clumsy jokes she made at midnight and did not pretend to be impressed by her wealth. They talked about small things at first, the bad traffic on 3rd Mainland Bridge, a book Helen liked, and then about bigger things, late-night calls when Amanda's calendar had emptier squares and Jacob's garage had fewer customers. There was never a single moment when everything changed. Love, in their case, was less like a bolt of lightning and more like rain that gathers quietly, and then, when enough drops have gathered, begins to flood a room. They met in a hotel once. They met in cafes where people did not whisper their names. The meetings were pockets of silence in a city that rarely paused. They spoke about their childhoods. Jacob about the night his father left the town with debts and hope both. Amanda about the empty cradle she had once waited beside, and the decision, cold and resolute, to make herself enough. In those rooms, Jacob felt seen. Mariam, who had learned to measure every word for weight, watched the change in Jacob like a storm watching a shoreline. She noticed his hands, the way he smoothed his sleeve when he lied about being late because of extra work. She noticed his new phone, modest but newer than their old model. She noticed the way he checked the time after a message came in. Suspicion is not a sudden eruption. It is a steady pooling of water under a door. Helen innocently called Amanda Auntie on the first visit because the woman liked the color in Helen's hair and had given her a small toy plane.
Amanda bought Helen a new uniform and some books that smelled like promise. Helen thought of Amanda as someone whose house had more rooms than the whole of their compound. Amid the small and the tender, a fissure began to form in Jacob's life. He loved Mariam in the way a man loves the habit of a lifetime. He loved Helen in a way that made him wake at night with the taste of guilt. But Amanda offered him a different kind of permission, to be unashamed. With every kind message, every unexpected bank alert, Jacob felt the sharp contrast between what was expected of him and what he might be allowed to become. Amanda's world was not only made of marble and meetings. There were corners of loneliness so private that even the houseplants seemed to bend away from them. She had friends who lived in the light of her reputation, and relatives like Amaka, her twin, who had a complicated map of dependence and resentment. Amaka lived with Amanda in the compound as a shadow that had refused to leave. She moved through the house like a weathered portrait, present and permanent. She could not or would not match Amanda's success. She made jokes that landed like stones and took for granted the meals and clothes that were not her own. Sometimes her voice carried a chip of contempt wrapped in a smile when she spoke about people they called neighbors. People like that, Amaka would say, using the phrase as an instrument. People like that are used to living in noise and inconvenience, she meant. She would look at Jacob as if evaluating a used product, functional but not suited for long-term investment. Where Amanda's generosity was a policy, Amaka's resentment was a household atmospheric condition. Amanda had learned to manage Amaka as she managed the rest of the world, with firm but gentle boundaries, a small kindness that did not surrender authority.
She would offer Amaka a new dress, and then, without dramatizing, ask that household accounts be balanced. Still, jealousy sometimes bloomed in Amaka's eyes. Jealousy, when it finds fertile soil, sends up shoots. Their meetings turned inevitably into something more tender. They were careful about discretion because discretion was survival for everyone involved. Physical affection was subtle, a hand on a shoulder, a lingering touch on the back, a shared umbrella in a sudden downpour, but it was enough to change the geometry of both their lives. Mariam found out, finally, when she discovered a receipt folded into pages where it did not belong. Confrontation came quietly, Mariam's voice low and cracked, the kind of trembling that matches an earthquake. "You have been lying to me," she told Jacob one night, the lamplight making a map on her face. "Who is she?" Jacob admitted what had been admitted in small ways before, not outright betrayal at first, but a confession of need and of a friendship that had gone further than he intended. He told Mariam about the school money and about the help.
He tried to explain tenderness as if it were a thing to be categorized, like receipts. Mariam heard him, but she also heard the parts he could not say. The hotel, the late messages, the softness in his voice when he said Amanda's name. In a country like theirs, gossip was an economy. People watched, and small talk in the market became a currency of its own. Mariam's reaction was not sudden rage, it was careful armor. "You are a man," she said, not in accusation, but in a weary, resigned voice that suggested she had expected one breach at some point. She warned him of expectations from above, from people who would be ready to take and never repay. She feared the looks at the gates of their compound. She feared the way their neighbors would clutch their purses and shift their children away. Jacob, because he loved them both in different ways, promised little and meant it until he was not sure what promises looked like anymore. He had not intended for things to shift. He had intended to accept help. Now help had been complicated by desire. He had not planned on the merciless bloom of feelings. Meanwhile, Amanda's life became softer at the edges. The executive who once measured her emails in efficiency now found herself lingering over messages from Jacob, smiling at odd hours. The loneliness that had been a steady hum receded slightly in the presence of his laughter. She had been for a long time accustomed to people who liked her because she could sign checks. Jacob liked her because she made him feel more than his circumstances allowed. He was small acts of normalcy, a steady job at her side, the frequency of his voice that did not ask for favors. It was in late August, when the rain was tired of falling and the city smelled of wet dust, that Amanda first noticed something odd in her body. At 65, she had learned to be attuned to her own signals. She had scheduled mammograms that came back clear. She had regular checkups because a life watched by markets and lawyers had to be kept in excellent health. But now there were changes. Nausea that arrived like an embarrassed guest, tiredness that hovered like a second skin, and a tenderness she could not quite classify. If it was anything, it was a new silence in the rooms that had once echoed with the sound of urgent calls. She called her physician, Dr. Olowu, a man whose way of speaking was the kind that inspired trust because it was always even, the words measured like currency. He had been Amanda's general practitioner for years, the sort of doctor who made handwriting look like a promise. When she described her symptoms, he did not smile in disbelief. He suggested tests. "At your age," he said, "we must be cautious." He was gentle with the sentence, aware of the deep history of menopause and the social maps that came with it. It is not common, but in medicine, uncommon does not mean impossible.
Amanda lay on the hospital bed in a room curated to feel human. Wooden panels, a small plant, an abstract painting that might have cost less than a modest house elsewhere. The ultrasound machine hummed with a kind of purpose. The technician, efficient and practiced, moved the probe with a surety that made the moment less cinematic and more clinical. Amanda watched the screen like someone looking at a map, searching for a small island. Dr. Olowu came in with his tablet and sat with the assessment measured on his face. He had already called in a consultant, had ordered blood work. The word rare hovered in the room, not an echo, but a fact. "We saw something on the scan," he said. He explained with the care of someone who knew the cultural weight of the word he was about to use. "There is a gestational sac. The blood results show elevated HCG levels consistent with early pregnancy." Amanda felt her breath leave her body as if the room had forgotten to breathe along with her. She had expected emptiness, the habit of a life already marked by a kind of finality, and instead found evidence on a screen that did not care for life narratives. Dr. Olowu used the word rare again, this time with a specific mechanism. "There are documented cases of late ovulation and rare hormonal variations. We call them outliers. The scans are clear, but we will continue to monitor." There it was then, a tiny, clinical confirmation that might, in the street mouths of Lagos, be called a miracle. The words the newspaper headlines would one day favor had not yet been spoken, but for Amanda, the phrase felt like a thunderclap. The nurse left the monitor on with the soft glow of numbers, and the room seemed to widen around her. Outside the hospital windows, the city went about its complicated business, indifferent and urgent. Inside, Amanda swallowed the new, strange shape of possibility. She found herself thinking of Helen, of Jacob's laugh, of Mariam's hands, of the way life had a way of insisting on continuing. She called Jacob then, hands trembling, or maybe that sensation was only inside. He answered within 3 rings. "Jacob," she said, and her voice was not the same voice that had negotiated contracts. It was smaller, unmoored. Doctors confirmed the impossible. The phrase hung between them like someone who had shouted into a canyon and was waiting for an echo. Jacob said nothing for a moment. In that pause, his life folded into sections he had not yet named. The Millionaire deposit, the nights when Helen slept with a book under her pillow, Mariam's face in the lamplight. He thought of loyalty like a fragile plate and wondered whether the pieces could be glued back. "Are you okay?" Jacob asked finally, because the world was a place that required action even when nothing about it felt sensible. Amanda laughed then, a short, incredulous sound. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know how to be this."
It is an odd thing to realize that something so private as the possibility of life could feel public in its consequences. The word pregnancy carried with it not only the embodiment of a child, but also the tidal effects on relationships, reputations, and expectations. In Lagos, where the newspaper hawkers could turn a whisper into a headline, Amanda understood that discretion would become an expensive art. Jacob drove to the same hospital that evening, hands steady on the wheel, though his insides were not. He had not planned for this. He had been a mechanic. He had assumed his life would continue to be measured by bolts tightened and engines coaxed back to life. He had not signed up to be the center of a story that could destabilize entire households. When he arrived, he sat in the visitor chair as if he were waiting for a verdict in a courtroom that had not yet met its judge. They spoke in low voices beside an automatic monitor, the city a distant murmur. Amanda told Jacob about Dr. Olowu's words: one-off ovulation, rare hormonal possibility, continuity with careful monitoring. He said not impossible as a scientific determination, she told Jacob, but rare, possible against probabilities. Doctors confirm the impossible, Jacob repeated, the title of the phrase slipping out of his mouth like a coin dropped into a well. It sounded strange coming from him, as if he were both narrator and participant in a story with too many eyes. In the days that followed, the hospital became a place of arithmetic and hush. Amanda's friends offered congratulations she did not feel ready to accept. Her board met, and a small, efficient power moved through the agenda like a ship through familiar waters. Amanda answered emails while thinking of the flicker of a heartbeat on a screen. She had built things from scratch before. She knew the discipline required to make something lasting. Yet this thing felt different, less an acquisition than an interior space rearranging itself without consent. Mariam, when she read the message that circulated in their small circle that Jacob had been at the hospital with Amanda for something serious, felt it like an accusation. She had warned him that favors could become shackles. Mariam had not imagined pregnancy when she had given that warning. She had imagined lesser things, debts that double, a pride bruised to the bone. Now the stakes were higher, not only the shape of their marriage but basic safety, the way neighbors might look past them differently. Jacob found himself in a landscape that had always been two-toned, the gray of the garage and the shining panes of glass in Amanda's world. He had stepped, carefully and then carelessly, across a line. He had not let it be a line for long. Yet even as he felt the warmth of Amanda's attention, a slow dread settled. He kept thinking of Helen's laugh, of Mariam folding clothes with a practiced, weary efficiency.
He imagined how scandal could twist small lives into ruin. Amanda, for her part, experienced a strange rebirth and a panic all at once. She had been lonely in ways that money had not fixed. That loneliness had made a different kind of woman, one who knew how to command rooms without letting them penetrate the emptiness. The idea of a child that might finally change who she was to herself, came with the terror of losing control. She had, in quiet moments, thought of adoption, of other forms of becoming. This did not fit in those neat boxes. It was messy and physical and immediate. But the evidence from Dr. Olowu was precise enough to be dangerous. Blood levels, scans, a note in his neat hand that the case required monitoring by an obstetrician with experience in higher-age pregnancies. He used the word viable with caution. He used rare again, like a talisman. "We will do everything we can," he said, "but you should understand the medical risks are higher. The world will react, and it may not be gentle." At the hospital gate, in the plant-lined corridor where the air smelled of antiseptic and something like hope, Amanda and Jacob stood for a long moment. They had to decide what to do with something that both ran away from and toward them. For Jacob, the decision felt like a fissure. To stay with the woman who had been honest and generous, and who now might be the mother of his child, or to flee into the sheltering, smaller life he had made with Mariam and Helen. Days turned into a pattern of calls and soft silences. Jacob found himself pacing outside the compound where he had once kept tools and dreams. He watched the sky as if the clouds could tell him whether this was a crossing back to safety or a bridge to be burned. He thought of loyalty not as a single thing but as many fragile pieces. He had no map for this. Around them, the city began to gather the first hints of gossip like a swarm. Neighbors noticed Amanda coming fewer times to the compound with her lawyer-like gait, and more times with the child-sized things she had purchased. A tiny pair of shoes that she left in a drawer, a small painting, a baby book that felt like a foreign country. Amanda called it preparations, framed in careful, bureaucratic language. Jacob called it not knowing. Mariam called it danger, the word sharp. There existed somewhere in the house Amanda owned photographs of a life she had fought to build. Late nights at the factory that had become a boardroom, the glossy magazine interviews, the plaques on the walls with engraved names. She stood before them as if testing her claim to her own history. She touched a plaque with thin fingers and suddenly felt like an interloper in her own museum. This new thing inside her body made the photographs look like artifacts from someone else's life.
A private moment arrived one evening when Amanda, restless and in need of counsel, invited one old friend, a woman named Nkechi, who had been around the circles of Lego's private philanthropy long enough to know how to be both joyous and discreet. They sat in Amanda's sitting room, the city lights beyond the window like a scattered constellation. "What will you do?" Nkechi asked. She was a woman who organized charity galas, but also listened with the kind of attention that felt like warmth. Amanda folded her hands and laughed in a soundless way. "I don't know," she said. "This changes everything. It also doesn't change anything." The sentence was an admission of the strange duality of her life, the businesswoman who contracted and expanded enterprise, and now a woman whose mornings began to involve irrational, uncontrollable tenderness. Nkechi chose her words with the caution of someone peering into a mirror that might crack. "People will talk, you know that, and they will try to make meaning of a thing you know is messy. But there are also people who will stand with you who matter. Decide what you want first." That was the question hanging like a chandelier over everyone involved. What did anyone want? Jacob wanted safety for his daughter and mercy for his wife, and perhaps, in a quiet corner of his dreams, the permission to be differently. Mariam wanted honor and the survival of a marriage. Amanda wanted a child, or maybe she wanted the idea of a child more than the child itself, and yet wanted to preserve the self she had built. In the city, rumor met fact and sometimes got in line with the truth. The phrase the papers might one day love, "Doctors confirmed the impossible," passed from private phone calls to the threshold of headlines. Jakob, in a moment where the weight of everything seemed to press down, whispered the phrase to no one and everyone. "Doctors confirm the impossible," he said to himself once, to the sound of rain against the corrugated roof of his garage. The phrase in his mouth had the texture of an incantation. Amanda found that the phrase had more power than news could hold. It rearranged the way friends looked at her. It changed the cadence of conversations. It made her think twice about where she could go without arousing speculation. At night, though, when she rested her hand on the small, indistinct shift beneath her ribs, the city and its whispers fell away. In that moment, she was only a woman with an unexpected interior life, and the rest of it, the money, the gossip, the moral calculus, felt like a thin wall. Jacob walked through the days like a man carrying both a ledger and a secret. Each time his phone buzzed with Amanda's name, he felt a small happiness and a larger dread. He went to work and greased bolts, tightening and adjusting, the world polite in its necessities. At night, he came home to Mariam's questions and Helen's school reports. He watched Mariam fold clothes, as if the act of folding might restore an equilibrium that had been broken by all the soft things he had accepted. And then there were the small, strangling moments of possibility. Helen coming to his bed to ask why Auntie Amanda had bought her a book. Neighbors whispering. The space between things seemed to have reduced into a narrow hallway where every step echoed. The hospital visits increased as the weeks dragged forward. Dr. Olawu remained measured and careful. He brought in a consultant from a teaching hospital in Ibadan to look over scans. They spoke of risks with clinical candor, the increased chances of complications, the need for vigilant prenatal care, the scale of attention required. Amanda listened with a soldier's calm. She accepted the recommendations and scheduled appointments like tasks in a ledger. She spent money on medical tests as if buying peace. The world gave them moments. A child's birthday at Helen's school where Jacob wore a borrowed suit. A dinner at Amanda's where there was laughter that felt fragile. A counseling session where Dr. Olawu urged moderation and vigilance. Each event contained within it the pressure of things waiting to be named. Jacob found himself standing more and more at thresholds. On Amanda's compound, the marble cool beneath his shoes, and in his own tiny flat, where Mariam kept the light low, as if low light could conceal exactly what was happening. He paid attention to the way the city sounded at night. He wondered whether this strange, improbable pregnancy would be a shelter or an accusation. Then, as the scans returned with measured language, and the consultant's notes were filed into a small, neat folder, a certainty arrived that would change the way silence felt. The blood work was consistent. The ultrasound images repeated what the first had shown. The consultant, a woman with spectacles and a voice like a balled-up cloth, said what Dr. Olawu had already phrased. "This is rare, but the evidence is present. We must proceed with caution." The phrase that had traveled from a clinical note into gossip reached a new pitch. Doctors confirmed the impossible, Jacob said out loud once more, as if to see how the syllables fit on his tongue. The words in the air made a map of their lives, marking new boundaries. And there, in the hush after the doctor's confirmation, with the city's pulse humming beneath the hospital windows, and family ties fraying like threads under stress, the question remained: how do two ordinary lives, a mechanic's skill marked by grease, and a businesswoman's life layered with polished glass, hold the truth of something both joyful and dangerous? How do they divide the consequences of a discovery that might make headlines, that might rewrite reputations and redraw relationships? The answer was not yet known. The evidence lay in the scans, in the blood counts, in Dr. Olowu's careful handwriting. For now, the impossible had been verified, and the verification sent ripples outward like stones dropped into a still pond. People glanced and wondered. Neighbors tightened their lips like envelopes. Jacob felt the weight of the world in a way he had not expected. Amanda felt both triumph and fear, as if joy and dread were alternating breaths in the same chest. What would happen next had not been decided. The small family that had once measured their days in debt notices and 2 hot meals pockets now stood on the brink of choices that would demand more than talking points or apologies. In the marble house, Amaka strolled past the nursery that did not yet exist, her face a study in something that might be called envy or fear. She had her own calculations. She had 2 young sons who needed upkeep, and a life that depended on the security of her sister's favor. The confirmation, the doctor's confirmation, matters noisier.
It did not, however, make them simpler. In the days after the hospital, Jacob found himself hearing the echo of Amanda's voice, saying the phrase with a tremor in it. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his hands, the calluses darkened by oils and work. Those hands had always been his story. Now they had been put into a different narrative, one that contained questions he could not answer. Outside, Lagos went on. Market women argued and barrows rolled by, Okadas sped with reckless bravado. Inside, the small units of human life rearranged. Mariam folding and unfolding her thoughts like paper cranes. Amanda making appointments and painting a room a soft, hopeful color. Helen clutching a new storybook to her chest as if it might contain the instructions for how to be loved by 2 worlds. The phrase would be repeated, of course. It was the kind of thing the city loved to keep on its tongue. Doctors confirmed the impossible would be said in different tones, as wonder, as accusation, as an iffy fact. For Jacob and Amanda, it meant something sharper. It meant consequences and choices, a strange intimacy grafted to reality, a set of decisions that would stretch friends and relatives into new positions. They had not been prepared for the way a line on a medical chart could act like a lever that moved the rooms around them. At night, when the city dimmed and the air cooled enough that the scent of the lagoon mixed with cooking oil, Amanda would sit by her window and press her palm against the place inside where she could no longer say nothing. She would place a hand on her belly and feel as if she were touching the edge of a map that had no familiar markings. She had everything in this life, and yet found herself trembling at the possibility of the future. Doctors confirmed the impossible, she thought, and each time the phrase moved through her, it felt less like a headline and more like a destiny she had not asked for and might yet embrace. Jacob, meanwhile, stood at his garage as if the place could absorb all the decisions he could not hold. He tightened bolts and tried to fix engines, and for the first time listened to the hum of possibility instead of the strict mechanical rhythms he had always relied upon. He imagined Helen in a school uniform that no longer had the shadow of a red chalk at the margins. He imagined Mariam's eyes less guarded. He imagined sometimes a life that had different lines to measure itself. And there, between the solidity of work and the softness of other people's hands, the story paused, not at an ending, but at a hinge. The medical confirmation had become a fulcrum. It lifted and it threatened. It promised a future and issued warnings. It made the city lean in. Doctors confirmed the impossible, Jacob thought again, as if speaking it could give him the shape of the next step. He had no clear answer. He had only the thin rope of choices, threads pulled taut. He would have to choose. So would Amanda. So would Mariam.
The rest of Lagos, with its hunger for story, would watch. For now, they breathed, and the air tasted of rain and possibility. If this is gripping you, and you want to follow every twist as these lives collide, do like and subscribe. It helps this kind of story find more ears and hearts. After the doctor's words had settled into the small filing cabinets of their lives, the days took on a new architecture. Amanda moved through her house with a different gait, as if every corridor might contain a surprise. She scheduled more appointments, took more calls, and spent an hour each morning watching the city wake from her balcony. Lekki's skyline like a row of promises, the water catching light. On some mornings, she felt lightheaded with joy. On others, the news felt like a stone she had swallowed and could not cough up. Amaka, meanwhile, performed normalcy with a strain that showed at the edges. She polished silver with a deliberate hand, arranged flowers as if ritual might reorder the world, and greeted visitors with a practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. Her resentment had not been a sudden invention. It was an inheritance, a slow comparison that had ossified into expectation. Where Amanda had built, Amaka had been offered the leftovers to manage. That had rankled for years. The pregnancy threatened to reorder that equilibrium entirely. Her sons, Emma and Chisholm, young men who had learned quick trades and quicker tongues, spent their afternoons in dubious thrift shops and under the erratic sun of street corners. They watched their mother with an easy loyalty and a younger man's hunger for security. For them, the news was not a philosophical puzzle. It was a recalibration of their prospects. "With this child," Amaka muttered once while stacking plates, voice low enough so the cleaner could not hear, "everything changes. She will tighten. She will give away even more." Her fingers paused on a plate's rim as if feeling for the shape of what she needed. The thought hardened into something sharper. If Amanda planned to take the world into her arms, there would be fewer arms left for her sons. Practicality, in Amaka's mind, had the texture of hunger. She walked the compound at odd hours, tested the locks on the nursery door that was still only an idea, listened to silences as if they kept secrets. When she spoke to her sons that night, she did not speak like a parent offering counsel. She put the plan between her words like a coin. "You must be ready," she told them. "When this happens, we cannot simply sit by. People will take things steadily. We must remind them what belongs to us." Her voice was low, the sort of whisper that could swallow a conscience. The idea she fostered was not born from pure malice. It had the geometry of a decision made by someone who believed the world had repeatedly taken from her.
There was a streak of survivor logic in it. Keep the family afloat. Ensure the boys, their education, their marriages, their futures. In Amaka's calculations, the pregnancy was an unpredictable variable. In the arithmetic of dependence she had been forced into, unpredictability was a threat. She sought counsel from people of different sorts. In a small room above a market, lit by a single bulb and smelling of tea and herbs, she spoke to a woman who traded in remedies. The woman listened with a slow, practiced face and said little that was new. "Life is messy," she whispered. "People are messy too." When Amaka mentioned consequences and the pressure of securing her son's futures, the woman's eyes narrowed, not in judgment, but in commerce. She had solutions for many anxieties. Some were spoken of plainly, others only hinted at. She offered talismans and teas and words that could calm the hand. She did not provide instructions, and she refused to be named here in more detail, only that Amaka walked away with something held in the palm of her hand like an unsaid promise. The possession altered Amaka. That night she told Emma and Chisholm there would be a plan. She spoke to them of timing and of patience, and she described, in blunt strokes, the ruined futures she would not allow for her boys. They listened. Youth often loves simplicity. They liked solutions, even if those solutions were shaded with risk. "We will ensure stability," Chisholm said, the vow landing heavy on the table. Jacob, for his part, never thought he'd be tempted by money in that way again. He had accepted Amanda's $1 million for the school fees with gratitude and a small, private shame. He had told himself the money changed nothing essential. But the day Amaka's number flashed on his phone, the universe he navigated tilted. He had expected calls from clients, not from the person he had seen only in the distance of Amanda's compound. He answered anyway, throat dry. "Jacob," Amaka said, voice cool and threaded with a practiced softness. "We need to talk." They met in a small cafe where the air smelled of roasted beans and simmering stew, where the chatter of lunchtime felt like a friend. Amaka arrived with a calm, a careful countenance, and there was a package in her bag wrapped in brown paper. She placed it between them as if it were a third person at the table, and Jacob felt suddenly like a boy caught with a prize he didn't know he deserved. "There are ways to keep what matters," she said, sliding the package closer. Her eyes did not look directly at his. "You are a good man, Jacob, smart. I can make sure your family never worries again." The offer was not articulated with blunt cruelty. It was instead a steady presentation of outcomes. Amaka spoke of school fees, of houses, of opportunities. She enumerated futures she believed she could secure for Mariam and Helen. The money she offered was more than generous. It was transformative.
It would remove the red chalk from school notice boards for years. It would buy them the breathing room Jacob had always wanted. "I don't want anything I can't live with," Jacob said before he realized it. He had not planned to negotiate his soul. The sound of his own voice surprised him with its honesty. "But you will," Amaka insisted gently. "Think of your child. Think of Mariam. Think of the doors. This need not be public. We can be discreet. No one need know. Just help us, Jacob. Help us keep the house stable. Help us keep what is ours." The bribe arrived like a test, and Jacob's handling of it was messy. He thought of Helen's laugh, and the night his daughter's teacher had held his hand and said, "We will try to help." He thought of Mariam's low-voiced prayers, of how she taped envelopes closed like they were treasure chests. When Amaka opened her bag and let him see bundles of notes, he felt both relief and a deep, cold contraction in his chest. It was the feeling of standing before two doors at once, and not being sure which door was a path and which was a trap. Jacob didn't take the money that day. He left with his hands empty, and his insides full of the kind of guilt that tasted of metal. But the idea lodged like a burr. He found himself returning to it at night, when payments were due and the red chalk inched closer. Temptation is not just an instant. It is a slow river that wears away at the banks of conviction. Mariam noticed the shift. Jacob had always hidden certain things from her, small comforts, extra calls, a missed debt. But this was different. It was an undercurrent she could not name at first. He came home with a new quiet, and his eyes fuller with thought. One evening, after Helen slept, Mariam watched him fold his hands, and finally asked, without the bitter preface, "Is there more?" He could have kept the money he never took a secret tucked in his chest, could have allowed the thought to decay into regret. Instead, something in him broke toward truth. He told Mariam about Amaka's visit, about the package he had declined. He told her about the whisper that had existed in his pockets like a hungry thing. He expected anger, a fling of plates, the ceremonial collapse. What he received instead was a silence so full of calculation it was almost prayer. "Take it," Mariam said after a long breath. Her voice was not broken so much as resolute. "If someone offers the kind of money that can buy safety for Helen, take it.
But do not do it for them. Do it for us." Jacob stared at her then, as if seeing Mariam in a new light. There was steel in her that had not been visible before. Pride had sat in her chest like a sentinel. Behind it now was a willingness to survive by whatever means did not destroy who they were. "If you take it, do not let it become a story that makes us small," she added. "If you take it, use it to run." The words cut a path in him. They reconfigured mercy into action.
Mariam, who had always been fierce about dignity, now proposed flight, not as shame, but as strategy. They would take the money only to leave, to pull Helen and themselves out of the smallness of a life determined by red chalk and late notices. There was the moral hazard of it all, to use Amaka's money offered for a different purpose, to escape the very dependence it sought to bind. It was a paradox, and it was a lifeline. Jacob felt both lighter and fouler for agreeing. He met Amaka again, this time in a less conspicuous place, and accepted an envelope with trembling fingers. He did not accept it to comply with Amaka's unstated request. He accepted it because Mariam had asked him to. The act was an inversion of the offer, taking the means to preserve his family's dignity away from the hands that thought they could buy it. The run was hurried and practical. They could not tell neighbors too many details. Mariam made lists, few and precise. Passport for Helen, even if domestic, clothes, a few keepsakes. Jacob spoke with a contact he trusted, a man who ran a small transport service between Lekki and Ada, and arranged for a van to be ready under the dusk. They packed quietly, as if the act of learning to leave had to be done without fanfare, lest the city notice the shifting. Amanda, in the meantime, continued to oscillate between cautious hope and clinical vigilance. She had grown used to checking her phone for lab results and phone calls. Her world had become a ledger of follow-ups. She also felt an emotional shelling. People who had praised her now whispered about luck or scandal. She kept Dr. Olowu's words near, repeating them like a shield. Rare, monitor, vigilant. These clinical reminders steadied her in the mornings. They could not prepare her for a different kind of betrayal. The discovery came in an accidental way. Amal, the cleaner, uncovered something out of habit while dusting a guest room, a small container tucked behind a drawer, its cap loose, and its smell faintly of sour tea and the market. If it had been any other house, it might have been mistaken for a forgotten cosmetic or a remnant of a previous resident's remedies. But Amanda, who had learned to notice details in boardroom documents and household accounts, looked at the container and saw not triviality but intent. It was not so much a smoking gun as a question with an edge. Why would something be hidden where no one should hide? She did not accuse. She called Amaka into the sitting room, and they sat across from one another like two sisters who had shared everything and now held pieces of different stories. "Where did you get this?" Amanda asked, voice quiet and even. For all her power, she did not want spectacle. She wanted clarity. She had been taught, by lawyers and accountants, to collect facts before making pronouncements. Amaka's face changed in a way Amanda had seen once as a child, the slow closing of defenses. She tried to back away with a smile that had been useful her whole life, a charm that had obtained small things but not absolutes. "Why would I have something like that?" she asked, too quickly. "Why would it be hidden in the drawer?" Amanda pressed. The question was not a shout, it was a scalpel. Amaka's sons lounged in the next room, pretending not to listen. They listened anyway. Amaka faltered. She reached for a script, then abandoned it. "I worry," she said finally. "I fear we will lose everything. People see change and think they can take more. I only sought to protect the family." Amanda had time to be more than a sister in that moment. She had been a CEO who built companies and set policy. She had also been a woman who had been lonely for years. The combination of practical authority and human hurt made her steadier than Amaka expected. "Protection does not justify harm," she said. "I will not have my house used as a theater for plans that endanger me." The conversation escalated into an argument tinged with colors neither woman had wanted to own. Amaka accused Amanda of forgetting the smallness of the world she had come from. Amaka accused Amaka of ingratitude.
The sons muttered in the next room, and a quiet, volcanic anger rose in Amaka. She threw back all manner of bitterness about sacrifices not recognized. She said the things that in families have weight like boulders, and in that moment the house felt thin. Amanda left the room to collect herself and thought of the word betrayal in its many forms: emotional, financial, familial. She had always believed in stewardship, a gentle yet firm management of what she owned. She had not expected someone to conspire to convert her vulnerability into a currency to be spent on someone else's security. She called Jacob into the house. She did not know what he had done with the envelope, but the fact that he had been seen with Amaka's sons gave her the right to ask. When he arrived, he looked older somehow, the lines around his face deeper, as if the extra weight of choices had carved them. "Did Amaka offer you money?" Amanda asked simply. Jacob's silence said what his voice might have failed to. He told the truth. He had been offered, he had accepted an envelope not to comply but to use it as the means of leaving. "I didn't go along with her," he said. "I took it so that Mariam and Helen could leave. She was going to give it. I told Mariam we would go." Amanda listened and felt the complicated burn of relief and humiliation. She had been afraid and now was suddenly confronted with facts that rearranged her options. The question for Amanda was not only about morality, but about the risk at hand, her health and the life inside her. "Did she say what she wanted in return?" Amanda asked. The clinician in her sought data before judgment. "She wanted discretion," she said. "She wanted things to be quieter. I refused to do what she meant."
"I used the money to get Mariam and Helen out. It was a betrayal in a new register, a personal breach, yes, but also an attempt to exploit Amanda's vulnerability. In Amanda's mind, the implication shocked and angered her, that her sister might attempt to manipulate another person's body, even by implication, was beyond tolerable. She called Amaka into the room again. There was no melodrama. The compound had too many witnesses already. Amanda had lawyers on retainer and a reserve of people who would back her if needs be. But what she wanted first was to be unequivocal in her boundary. She told Amaka she would not stand for plans aimed at harming her or the child. She told her that the house was not a marketplace for morals. She told her to leave. Amaka's face crumpled in a way that was more storied than a sudden temper. Her sons rose, not so much in defense as in confusion, and collected their things. The affair that had been a family affair, lodged in shared histories and complex dependencies, rattled free of pretense. Amaka packed a few bags. She left like someone who had been expelled from the only steady heartbeat she had known for years. The compound tasted of aftermath. Amanda's motherly impulses wrestled with the executive in her. She wanted to gather Amaka and spit out the bitterness like a splinter. She also had to protect herself and the child. She made it clear, Amaka had to go. The eviction was not theatrical, it was practical and tidy. She signed off the accounts that kept the house running for Amaka and her sons. The legalities were swift and unyielding. Amaka, who once walked as if entitled to the house's corners, found herself outside the gate with a modest bag and 2 bewildered boys. The public response was not as explosive as gossip might have predicted. Perhaps it was because Amanda handled it in a way that minimized fodder, or perhaps because Lagos had 1,000 smaller topographies of scandal to attend to. But inside the small universe of those affected, lives had shifted like tectonic plates. Jacob and Mariam left at dawn, the city still half asleep. They moved quickly and with the practiced stealth of those who have made departures before. Helen sat between them in the back of the van with a handful of books and a stuffed toy that smelled of home. Jacob looked at Mariam across the front seats and saw not only a woman he had wronged, but the single person who had, in the end, offered him the method for preserving his family. "We'll call when we can," he said, though he knew calls might be precious in the days ahead. The van rolled away from Victoria Island's glass towers toward a quieter life in Outa, where rent was lower and the market was a few steps closer. Jacob felt for the first time in months a small thing resembling freedom. It was uneven and precarious and tasted like the heat of the road.
Amanda went to the hospital after the confrontation, not because she needed to confirm the pregnancy again, but because the emotional violence of what had occurred had left her shaky. Dr. Oluwu and the consultant had been watching the case with clinical respect. Now they watched it with the following of a life that had suddenly been made not only a medical curiosity, but a potential target for scandal. He reviewed the notes and the scans and repeated once more, in the calm way that had become his hallmark, that monitoring must continue. "We must proceed with vigilance," he said. "There are social hazards as well as medical ones." Amanda listened and thought of the phrase that had become a headline in their private lives. Doctors confirmed the impossible. The phrase had been a label, an astonishment. Now it felt like a call to stewardship. She resolved, in that sterile room smelling of antiseptic and lunch,
to protect that small life with the same determination she had used to build an empire. She placed a hand on her belly and felt a tremor of something that could be fear or hope. Parenthood, for the first time, seemed less like an acquisition and more like a covenant. She walked back into the compound like someone who had crossed a river and paid the ferryman. There would be consequences for Amaka, legal, familial, perhaps even moral. Amanda had not been cruel in expelling her sister. She had been precise. She would not allow the house to be a place where someone's fear could be turned into another's harm. In the weeks that followed, Amanda's life settled into a strange rhythm. She held meetings at the office and napped in the afternoons. She read books aloud into her phone at bedtime, believing already in the power of voice. She made arrangements for heightened security, but also took to gardening in the early hours, hands in the soil. It soothed her in a way money could not. She spoke at a board meeting, and for the first time did not feel like the person held together by only public acclaim. In the glow of small, private acts, she felt a kinship with things that could not be bought. Jacob's family found shelter in a small rented place where the landlord charged in a currency of trust, weeks in advance, in exchange for a promise of steadier bread. The envelope Amaka had provided, the one Jacob had taken, not to obey but to flee, had bought them a month or two of safety. It bought Helen's uniform, it bought Mariam an ability to breathe, and it bought Jacob a time to think and earn again without the immediate pressure of red chalk. But the money also bought a moral price. In the market, where tongues were sharp and memories longer than receipts, gossip found its way to them. People who had known Jacob since his apprenticeship whispered about the man who had taken money from a woman like that. Some voices were condemnatory, others half apologetic, saying things like, "He did what he had to."
Mariam faced now a community whose solidarity was mixed with suspicion. She took her children to school and did not stand in queues to explain herself. She had no interest in franking out her failures for public consumption. She wanted steadiness. Jacob took work at a busier garage, fixing commercial vans and taking more calls for night jobs. He worked at the pace of someone who felt a debt to be repaid, not to others, but to himself. He had promised Mariam that they would rebuild in ways that required patience. Each bolt he tightened made him feel like a man reconstructing what had shifted inside his chest. Amanda, from her corner of the city, watched their movements not with possessiveness, but with a complex tenderness. She had been betrayed by the idea that family could be transactional. She had not been betrayed by Jacob alone. The business of love is less tidy than the economy she had managed. She had loved in ways that had been tender and that had also broken a household. She felt culpable. She felt fierce. When the press finally caught wind of the story, the coverage was curated more than sensational. Amanda's team employed strategy, facts, a medical note, a portrayal of respect for privacy. Amanda allowed a statement that thanked the medical professionals and asked for privacy. The press, hungry for two clear sides, fixated on simple dichotomies: age versus youth, wealth versus poverty. The city, for a day or two, took sides in whispered conversations. But life, stubborn and ordinary, kept moving. Amanda went to checkups and lay on stainless steel beds, while monitors showed lines that meant so much and yet so little. She had a different kind of maternity education: doctors who knew the parameters of risk, midwives who taught breathing, a consultant who spoke of the statistical probabilities with gentle candor. "We will do what we can," they said, and she learned to find in that sentence both humility and courage. Jacob did not return to Amanda's compound. He did not visit the house that had been the center of his turmoil. He and Mariam sent an occasional message, measured and practical. He thought of Amanda often, but now with a more careful lens. What had occurred had created new fissures. The desire to be kind and the need for boundaries now sat like a complicated seam between them. He loved Amanda in a way that had altered the architecture of his heart, but he also loved his wife and his daughter in ways that were carved into his hands. A legal standoff lingered in the background. Amaka, pushed into a corner, pursued complaints that were at once personal and petty. She claimed wrongful eviction in tones that made her son's futures the subject of public pity. Amanda, steady in her legal counsel, responded with firm letters. The courts, slow and formal, took their time. For Amanda, the legal process was secondary to the more urgent act of protecting the life within her. For Amaka, it was an avenue to declare injustice and perhaps to win sympathy. The public watched, divided between empathy and judgment. One evening, when rain came thin and the city exhaled in wet relief,
Amanda stood by her balcony and let the water patter on her bare feet. She thought of the strange woman she had been and the stranger she had become. For years she had been a builder of empires and the manager of time. Now she also found herself a bearer of a fragile possibility. She had to reckon with the way affection had erupted in unlikely places, and she had to reconcile the fact that love sometimes arrives in ways that complicate the moral map. "Doctors confirm the impossible," she said aloud to the empty room, testing the phrase like a stone in her palm. It had become an incantation to make sense of change. She did not know if the city would forgive or applaud her choices. She only knew that she had been given something tiny and volatile, and that she intended to steward it with all the cautious love she could summon. Jacob's escape gave his family air, but not absolution. In the small apartment in Oda, Mariam lay awake and considered the cost of survival. She had wanted dignity. She had accepted an instrument of escape that might always be whispered about. Sometimes she rose in the night and listened for Helen's breathing, an ordinary human music that told her everything would be all right. She and Jacob made plans for a year, for Jacob to save, for Helen to attend school without the shadow of the red chalk. They patched up relationships by small acts, teaching Helen to count, helping her with homework, visiting neighbors to exchange food and stories. The slow work of rebuilding, they discovered, was often more honest than the swift transactions they had once believed would change everything. Amaka and her sons, humiliated and bitter, had to rebuild too. They moved into a small house where material comforts were fewer, but the days required an account of what remained. Amaka tried to remake her life by small trades, running a stall, lending a hand where she could. She started grudgingly to accept that not all loss could be turned into gain. Her sons, resentful and raw, found their steps uncertain, their futures looser than before. There was no easy reconciliation. There was only the slow accrual of days and the hard work of living with consequences. Amanda, on the other hand, cultivated small joys. She bought a tiny cradle she never spoke of in public, only in the quiet afternoons when the house seemed to lean in. She planted a row of ferns and watched them take root. She kept up with the monitoring schedule and learned all the names of the nurses who smiled as if they had a private stake in what grew under her ritz. She walked sometimes among the staff and brought cake for the security guards. She learned what it meant to be known by the people who kept the house running.
There were, in the months that followed, moments of small grace. Helen sent a drawing for Amanda, a rainbowed scribble of a house and 2 women and a car, tucked into a letter that smelled faintly of crayons. Jacob kept the letter folded into his wallet like a secret liturgy. Amanda received the drawing and wept quietly at the kitchen table, not from loneliness now, but from a fierce sort of tender gratitude. The doctor continued to speak in measured tones. There were, as he had said from the beginning, increased risks. There were nights Amanda lay awake imagining every possible complication. Dr. Alowu explained procedures and contingency plans with a professionalism that both comforted and sobered her. There were days she felt too old and days she felt like someone who had been handed a second life. The phrase, "doctors confirm the impossible," now occupied a double register. It was both headline and him. Jacob, who had been tempted by an envelope and saved by Mariam's willingness to run, found his own moral center in small renewals of trust. He returned to his garage with a new set of dreams, to earn honestly, to create a buffer for his family so they need not accept offers from the mouths of desperation. He went to training sessions arranged by a small vocational program and learned modern diagnostic tools. He had never thought of himself as a student again, but learning was a virtue that tasted like hope. The weeks gathered into a season. Amanda's belly became a private map of small changes. She laughed more easily, and then less. She wept sometimes in the office bathroom, hands on the sink as if to steady the world. The city whispered, as cities do, and people took sides in conversation and in silence. Then, in a hospital room lit by the honest glare of medicine, they reached a cusp. Scans now showed a heartbeat more emphatic and repeated. The consultant murmured to Dr. Alowu and then, with careful kindness, said what they both had been watching for. The pregnancy remained viable as of the last appointment. "We are encouraged," the consultant said. "Still vigilant, still cautious, but encouraged." Amanda closed her eyes and let the words wash through her like a benediction. She had been the subject of rumor and the target of a desperate plan, the owner of a company that made policy and the bearer of a life that had not been part of her initial plan.
But in that room she felt something older and more tender than any balance sheet, the simple knowledge that a heartbeat was faintly there, insisting. She called Jacob that night. He answered with a voice that had been tempered by distance and work. They spoke not of love as commodity or conquest, but of human things. Helen's latest drawing, Mariam's plan for savings, the name Jacob suggested for a child he had never expected to father.
They spoke like two people who had been remade by events, and who had learned to consider consequences like the weather. Variable, intense, but manageable if one prepared for rain. Doctors confirmed the impossible, Jacob said again, as if the phrase could anchor them both. The words this time seemed less like news and more like an admission. Life would never again be simple. The final days of this chapter were not tidy. There were no cinematic reconciliations in the driveway, no solidified vows. People chose different forms of repair. Amaka worked the market and gradually understood that dependency had a cost she could not levy without losing herself. Jacob and Mariam built a steadier life together, their marriage not perfectly restored, but working on the honest terms of mutual survival. Amanda, who had been both the giver and the receiver of charity in different measures, prepared for a child who would be born into a world complicated by class and rumor, but also by fierce protection. The city continued to spin indifferent to individual dramas. Markets hawked, buses sped, and the lagoon reflected neon and dusk. But within the small circles that had been rearranged by a dead battery, a generous card, and a doctor scan, something new had taken shape. Lives that were more honest for the fractures that had been exposed. On a late afternoon, Amanda sat in the nursery she had begun to furnish, a small room with a pale blue wall and a single row of tiny shoes arranged on a shelf. She placed a hand on her belly and thought of the oddness of fate. She had been a woman who measured success in acquisitions. Now she measured it in small, quiet acts, the cadence of a feeding schedule, the selection of a blanket, a lullaby learned from a nurse. She felt gratitude and a cautious joy. The house was quieter now that Amaka had left. The silence was not empty, but spacious. Jacob, driving with Helen in the back seat, watched the skyline retreat and felt an ache that was not only penitential, but hopeful. He had made choices that had cost him honor and given him possibility. He had fled with his family and used the very instrument meant to bind them as the means of freedom. He had been weak in temptation and strong in confession. The road ahead was uncertain, but for once he could see it. As dusk fell and the city's lights turned on like constellations, some questions remained unresolved. The legal consequences for Amaka, the way society might judge the child, whether Jacob and Amanda's relationship would find a form that was not destructive to others. But the immediate crisis, the threat to Amanda's life, had been thwarted by exposure and firmness. The envelope had bought Jacob's family a life. The house had been purged of a threat. The doctors had confirmed that the pregnancy was continuing. Doctors confirmed the impossible. The phrase rose in the air, no longer merely a headline, but a contour of human possibility. It had reshaped reputations and demanded choices. It had forced people to look at their values and at the costs of their confusions. The story closed not on a final resolution, but on a poised, aching hope. Amanda stood by the balcony and watched the city lights, her hand resting where a life fluttered uncertainly inside. She thought of Helen's drawing and of Mariam's resolve, of Jacob's hands, grease-stained and steady, and of Amaka's complicated, human bitterness. She breathed in the rain-scented air and felt, for a moment, the whole city like a chorus around her, some voices sharp with judgment, others soft with empathy, most indifferent. In the center was the tiny, stubborn pulse that had appeared on a screen months ago. For those who had watched with their fingers pressed to the timeline of events, for those who had whispered and gossiped and judged, the end was only a beginning. There would be legal tangles and personal reckonings. There would be questions about legitimacy and about the future of two families who had briefly intersected. But for now, in the soft glow of that evening, there was a single, unarguable fact. The doctors had confirmed what everyone else called impossible, and a life that none had planned for was quietly asking to be loved. Amanda pressed her palm to the small rise beneath her shirt and let the city sound shape itself into a lullaby. She did not know what choices the future would demand of her, nor if Jacob would return to stand with her in the public eye. She only knew that she had decided, with a resolve sharpened by betrayal and loss, to protect this life against the world's curiosities. She would face whatever judgment came with the kind of discipline she had always afforded to her business, careful, relentless,
honest. Outside, Jacob steered the van through the narrowing lanes of Auda, Helen asleep against the window, Mariam's head leaning for a moment on his shoulder. He thought of the phrase and knew that it would follow them, a headline in the mouths of people who like to make neat stories. He also knew something quiet and more persuasive. The future was not yet written, and the small acts of love they did now could shape what tomorrow would hold. Doctors confirm the impossible, he whispered again, not as news, but as a benediction for all their fractured, hopeful human selves. If you want to find out what happens next, how the city judges them, whether the law takes a side, and whether this improbable child will reshape their lives, subscribe and follow Amanda's journey. The next chapter will ask the hardest question: what does it mean to protect a life born at the intersection of wealth, poverty, and impossible circumstances?